with a fairly basic but difficult question, which is what makes for a great sports journalist?
Well, I think it's changed a lot, and well, that's a little too high. I think it's changed a lot since I got into this, and I think that's probably what we'll get into a lot today. When I first started 13 years ago, sports journalism was totally different than it is now. I think it's probably changed more in the last 2 or 3 years, and if you talk to people who've been in the business a lot longer than me, they'll say it's changed more in the last 2 or 3 years than it probably did in the 30 years before that. And I think the basic principles are the same. You know, you want to be fair. It's the same journalistic principles you would apply to anything else. You just happen to be writing about sports. You want to make sure that you get both sides. I'm proud of the fact that in 13 years I've never had a player tell me that they felt they were misquoted, and I think that's important. But the business has changed so much that I think what the various media outlets are looking for in terms of what is a good sports journalist has changed so much that, again, it's hard to quantify it. The internet has changed everything. I used to write as a sports columnist for the Sun-Sentinel. I used to write 4, maybe 5 columns a week. Now I write maybe 1 or 2 a week, but I blog, I do TV, I also host a radio show. And in all of those different mediums, the rules are a little bit different. And so I think what makes for a good sports journalist in one medium may not be the same as what makes for a good sports journalist in another medium, and I think that's something Evan and I can get into a little bit. I think that the standards are a little bit different, whether it's online or in newspapers. But I think, again, the basic tenets are the same, which is that you want to be fair. I always feel like I want to put the reader at the game. I think that's important. One of the benefits that we get in this job, and sometimes it's a detriment, but should be a benefit, is we have access. We have access to the coaches, we have access to the athletes, and the average fan doesn't have that. And that's what we can provide that is different than the person that's sitting on their couch and maybe just blogging off a game or commenting on what they see. We get to actually go in there and try to get the perspective of the people who are playing or coaching the games. And I think that that's what I try to provide through my coverage. And again, to try to provide some fairness to both sides of every story, even if there are guys that maybe you encounter that you don't like so much. You want to evaluate what they're doing on the field and how their performance has been for a team or with their teammates.
Well, just to add on to that, I think a few things. In terms of what makes a good journalist from a radio perspective, it's being you, being yourself. And just like to use Ethan as an example, if you read his stuff in the Sun-Sentinel, if you've read his stuff in the Sun-Sentinel over the course of time, it's his writing style, but it's not necessarily his personality. Versus if you listen to him on the radio, or if you read his blog, he has an opportunity now in today's day and age to be himself. Who is Ethan Skolnick, not what is Ethan Skolnick writing? And I think that is a lot of the change. For me, from a radio perspective, is I can come on the air every single day and I can give you scores, I can say what happened in a game, but you can do that. It's how can you relate to me? Okay, how can you relate to the guy who's on the air, who's a diehard Mets fan, who's going through the pain every single day of watching that team lose? Hey, I'm also a Dolphins fan. I can relate to that. Being yourself. It's also outworking the next person in an honest, moral way. It's having the approach of working 8 days a week, and if you work 7, you have an off day. I mean, seriously, that's what makes a good journalist. If Ethan says on the weekend, you know what, I'm not in the mood to blog. Well, then why do you have a blog?
Right.
I mean, if you look at it, what's on your mind? How are you going to present yourself? How are you going to stand out for the next person? It's doing the multimedia stuff. It's funny that the two of us are sitting here today together when we've been on the radio together multiple times, okay? We've been on TV together multiple times. You know, I've now started to get into the writing from a blog perspective on our station's website. It's understanding, outworking the next person by doing everything you possibly could do. It's not just one medium. What makes a good sports journalist is to go watch PTI. Watch on ESPN, pardon the interruption, Michael Wilbon and Tony Kornheiser. What do those guys not do? They write, they do radio, they do television, they do everything you possibly can imagine, and they do it as much as you possibly can imagine. And they do it in an honest, moral way where you know who they are. And to me, that makes a good sports journalist.
And I just want to add to that, too. You know, when I first got into this thing, I think a lot of people, and I did too, you kind of looked down upon the people that you felt weren't being honest to the writing craft. And you said, well, this guy's doing all this TV, this guy's doing all this radio. You know, doesn't he care about the 3-4 columns a week he's writing for the paper? Now it's a necessity. The economics have changed it. I don't think it's enough for a sports journalist just to do one thing, as Evan was mentioning. You're kind of your own media enterprise at this point. You know, you have to do all these other things. That's why I did the radio show. That's why, again, Evan and I have done some television together. And that's the difference, and I think that's been one of the difficult transitions for me, is as a sports journalist, I was trained to kind of keep myself out of it. You're taught as a sports columnist, don't use the word I. Don't make it about yourself, make it about the people on the field. Radio is totally different. You can be a fan in a radio environment. And Evan, anybody who's listened, is a Met fan. I don't root for any teams anymore. When I got into this business, I grew up in New York. I rooted for all the New York teams. I really, and when I tell people I just don't care who wins, I don't. And that's been different as I've tried to cross back into that, into your medium, and to say, okay, now I actually have to show some passion for some things that I was taught all those years through journalism school. You know what? You're not supposed to be passionate about those things. And I find myself, or always found myself at games, rooting for players I liked, rooting for deadlines that were a game that ended before my deadline, or those kind of circumstances, rather than rooting for a particular team. And it's a very different medium. And as you see the Tony Kornheisers, the Dan Levitards, the people who have crossed over into more than one area, they've had to make that transition also, but that's a product of the changing environment.
Yeah, it's funny, the rooting aspect of it. The Mets are the only team I have left. Like, people ask me what team do you root for in the NFL, and I don't have an answer. What team do you root for in the NBA? And I mean, I grew up a Knicks fan, but it was tough for a long time. But I've kind of lost that allegiance to teams. And I think, just to back up what Ethan was saying, is you root for people. You root for the people that you're friendly with. You root for the people that you have relationships with. And you don't necessarily root for their team, but you root for them to do well. And again, but if you have to come on the air and rip them apart, right, you got to do that. I mean, if Ethan's friends with Jason Taylor and Jason Taylor doesn't handle the Dolphin situation well, in the newspaper, he doesn't necessarily have to write about it. You can't go on the air for 3 hours every morning and not talk about it.
And that does create a lot of conflicts. And I remember there's even differences within the newspaper business. And I was a beat writer. And when you're a beat writer, what you're doing is you're covering one team every day. And I've been a beat writer on the Heat for 3 years, for the Dolphins for 3 years. It means you travel to all their games, and you're supposed to know everything that goes on, every injury, every transaction, and all the rest. But you're impartial. And what you do as a beat writer, and my philosophy was always, because I was always one of the younger guys, was I developed friendships with a lot of the athletes. And there was kind of a trading of information. I would tell them when I heard something was going on. They would give me a tip when they heard something was going on. Then I became a columnist, and that empowered me to give my opinion. The problem with that was a lot of the guys that I covered who were accustomed to having this kind of buddy-buddy relationship with me were like, hey, what are you doing, man? You're ripping me for this. I thought we were boys. And that changes a lot. And I think I found the same thing in the radio environment. So you have to build enough credibility that when you have an opinion that people respect it, that the athletes respect it, but especially that they understand you're not ripping them just to be nasty. You're ripping them, or you're being critical because that's your job and because you're talking to other guys in the locker room or coaches and the like who are telling you something that leads you a certain direction.
And there is an honesty factor with that. I mean, that's the thing. It's that if you have a relationship with that person, there's a couple of ways of going about it. Either, hey, I'm going to give you a heads up. I am going to be critical of what happened in this game tomorrow in the paper, whatever it may be. Or, like I remember a couple of summers ago when there was all the controversy, if you remember, with the Miami Heat as to who the coach was going to be, Pat Riley or Stan Van Gundy, when Stan Van Gundy was still the head coach. And Alonzo Mourning was on the show that I do, and I had been critical of Alonzo Mourning, and literally the first thing I said on the air, because the assumption is somebody didn't read it, or somebody didn't hear it, or somebody didn't hear it, see it. Well, Zoe, I said X, Y, and Z about you. How would you respond to that? So, there's a credibility factor. It's understanding that, hey, you got to be honest and upfront and let those people know you have been critical. And I think more times than not, if you give them that heads up, if there is that interaction, they respect you more, and they're more likely to talk to you again about it.
The worst guys are the worst guys are the run and hide guys. And there are a lot of those in this business. There was a prominent columnist in New York, you probably know what I'm talking about, who would rip Pat Riley on a regular basis and basically killed him when he left, and he sent the fax to the Knicks and to say he was leaving. And that guy never, all those years that he played the Knicks in the playoffs, that guy never showed up at a Pat Riley press conference. To me, one of the key things is if I'm going to be critical of somebody, I'll be in the front row the next day. Because at the very least, you want the guys that you're writing about or talking about to see you, to know who you are, and to know, look, you're not just some guy who's shooting from the dark.